Mike Mamoli.
Thank you, Mr. President. This final foreign trip of your presidency is obviously playing out in very different circumstances than you might have expected. A very different transition is underway than the one you might have envisioned. Given that, though, I wonder if you've intentionally sought to approach this trip reflecting more on the powers of and the influence of the presidency on the world stage, so that you might be able to offer the kind of counsel to your successor that he has said he hopes to draw upon. And also, on a political note, you talked often during your re-election campaign about this fever that had consumed the Republican Party, an effective political strategy that they employed to block you even on issues where there might have been some common ground.
Right.
What would be your advice to Democrats who might see that kind of strategy as the same kind of path to taking back power that the Republicans employed? And related to that, what would your advice be to House Democrats about whether or not to re-elect Nancy Pelosi as the party leader in the House?
Well, I'll work in reverse. I think Nancy Pelosi is an outstanding and historic political leader. So much of what we accomplished was accomplished because of her smarts, her tenacity, her legislative skill. And I don't normally meddle with, party votes. And certainly on my way out the door, probably I shouldn't meddle here, but I cannot speak highly enough of Nancy Pelosi. She combines strong progressive values with just extraordinary political skill. And she does stuff that's tough, not just stuff that's easy. She's done stuff that's unpopular in her own base because it's the right thing to do for the American people. I think she's a remarkable leader. With respect to Democrats and Republicans and how Democrats should deal with a new administration, I think you give them a hearing. I certainly don't want them to do what Mitch McConnell did when I was elected, meet the day of and say, our sole objective is to not cooperate with them on anything, even if the country is about to go into a depression, so that we can gain seats in the midterms and ultimately defeat them. That's not why the American people send us to Washington, to play those games. So that's not my advice to Democrats. My advice to Democrats is know what you care about and what you stand for, and fight for your principles, even if it's a hard fight. If there are areas where the new administration is doing something that's going to be good for the American people, find a way to work with them. If you think it's going to be a problem, then say so and make the argument. The touchstone is what's good for the American people. And that's worked for me. It means that at the end of the day, and at the end of 8 years, I can look back and I can say that I consistently did what I thought was best. Doesn't mean you don't make mistakes, but it means that you're being true to your oath and the commitments you made to the people who elected you. And in terms of reflecting on the U.S. presidency as I've been traveling, I think the main reflection I have and the main advice that I give to the incoming president is the United States really is an indispensable nation in our world order. And I say that as somebody who has gone out of his way to express respect for every country and its people, and to consistently acknowledge that many of the challenges that we face are not challenges that America can solve on its own. But what I also know is that the basic framework of the world order coming out of World War II and then on through the end of the Cold War was shaped by a set of ideals and principles that had worked for the vast majority of people, not just in America, but around the world. The notion of democracy and rule of law and a free press and independent judiciary and open markets and a social welfare state to moderate some of the sharp edges of capitalism, and lifting up issues of human rights and investing in public health and development, not just within our own borders, but elsewhere in the world. And working with multilateral institutions like the United Nations, making sure that we're upholding international norms and rules. That's what's made the modern world. And there have been times where we ourselves have not observed some of these norms as well as we should and have been accused of hypocrisy. Here in Latin America, there have been times where countries felt disrespected and on occasion had cause for that. There are times where we haven't observed these values in our own country and have fallen short of our ideals, but that basic structure is the reason why the world is much wealthier, much more secure, and yes, less violent, healthier, better educated, more tolerant than it was 50 years ago. And that requires constant work. It doesn't just happen on its own. I've said this in Europe. I've said this in places where there's this pushback against this modern order. But you take an example like Europe, before that order was imposed, we had 2 world wars in the span of 30 years. In the second one, 60 million people were killed. Not 500,000, not 1 million, but 60 million. Entire continents in rubble. In places like the Asia Pacific, before that order existed, you routinely saw famines of millions of people. Not just concerns about low wages, but people dying because they didn't have any food or drinking water, or died of cholera or simple diseases if somebody had some penicillin. And so what I would say would be that we all share responsibilities for improving that order and maintaining it and making sure it's more inclusive and delivers greater hope and prosperity for more corners of the world. We all have responsibilities, every nation, in respecting the dignity and worth of their citizens, and America can't do it all for everybody else. There are limits to our reach into other countries if they're determined to oppress their people or not provide girls education or siphon off development funds into Swiss bank accounts because they're corrupt. We're not going to be able to handle every problem, but the American president and the United States of America, if we're not on the side of what's right, if we're not making the argument and fighting for it, even if sometimes we're not able to deliver it 100% everywhere, then it collapses. And there's nobody to fill the void. There really isn't. there are other very important countries, like a China, where we can't, if it weren't for China's cooperation, we couldn't have gotten the Paris Agreement done. But China's not the one who was going around organizing 200 nations to sign on to a Paris Agreement, or putting together the paper and the policy outlines and the conceptual framework. Russia is a very significant military power, but they're not worrying right now about how to rebuild after a hurricane in Haiti. We are. And I've said before, that's a burden that we should carry proudly. And I would hope that not just the 45th President of the United States, but every President of the United States understands that that's not only a burden, but it's also an extraordinary privilege. And you know, if you have a chance to do that right, then you should seize it. All right? Thank you, everybody.